Well, the nation is just a few weeks away from the May 29 elections, and there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of expectation, and as you've seen, a whole lot of contestation before that historic day arrives. And in this context, South Africans now have a report on cost and the scope of what the last 30 years of freedom have meant. Part of that inventory is the release of the 30 Years Review of Democracy report. It's a compendium of numbers that measures the state of us. And this report is structured on 13 thematic areas viewed through the objectives of 4 key policies that have been adopted over the last 30 years. But here's what I want to talk about. This occasion coincides with the 28th anniversary of South Africa's adoption of its constitution. It's a document that has been hailed by progressives across the world, and it is that part we're going to focus on in this next interview. We are still lucky to be able to have the architects of our freedom and our constitution with us, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Justice Albie Sachs to the program. Later, we're hoping to be joined by Nomahlubi Khwinana, who is a human rights commissioner, to reflect on the constitution and where South Africa is now. Judge Sachs, good evening. I appreciate your time. I believe you were at a dinner party and you've sneaked out to talk to us. I've told them to keep your dessert for you. Thank you for joining us. How do you mark this special occasion? Was that what the dinner was for?
It's a lovely coincidence, and they're watching on TV in the other room now, eating their dessert, and they say, if I perform well enough tonight, then I'll also get dessert. So be kind to me. But what I can say is...
Your dessert is safe, Judge. Your dessert is safe. Go ahead.
Yes. Now, what I want to say is there's a piece that's left out of the story. The story is, and it's a wonderful story, on March the 9th, 1996, 2 years after they started, the Constitutional Assembly wrapped up their work, signed, sealed, and delivered the Constitution. Thabo Mbeki made a most marvelous, wonderful speech. There was singing. All protocol was not observed. It was Parliament, the Constitutional Assembly, erupting with a sense of joy and accomplishment. But they didn't know that there was a pesky constitutional court waiting to receive the document. And this Nordic Constitutional Court, of which I was a member, received the document and said, in rather more pompous legal language, "Aikona." The whole basis of the Constitutional Assembly's working, an agreement of everybody to come in, was that certain principles would be agreed to in advance. So that it wouldn't mean a majority gets into Parliament, they can do what they damn well like, and they can do to us what we did to them. It was agreed that there would be principles agreed to in advance that would be binding on the Constitutional Assembly, and a special institution called the Constitutional Court of South Africa was created, external, independent people, to see if the text of the Constitution, as was adopted on March the 9th, complied with the principles. I was actually put in charge by my colleagues of sorting out all the complaints and challenges, and we had 70 challenges. We set aside 10 days of hearings in the Constitutional Court, for and against the text, and in the end, we said overwhelmingly there was compliance, but in 9 respects, it didn't. So we had, the effect was the Constitutional Court of South Africa declared the Constitution to be unconstitutional, and we sent it back. That's why it took many, many more months before.
That certainly is a fascinating and interesting piece of our history, as you say, lesser known, that, you know, there was certainly an important amount of homework to do, and that was one of the principal tasks, or the, you know, pioneering tasks of the Constitutional Court. This next piece, and just indulge me a little bit, because I feel it's important to preface the next question. Your life story, Justice Sachs, is so interwoven with the history of the country. You were just a teenager when your activism took hold. You kept a wish, I understand, that your father had for you to embark on a life of service for justice. You took part in the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign. You were there when the Freedom Charter was adopted in Kliptown, and as many South Africans know very well, You were working very closely with ANC leader Oliver Tambo in exile when that bomb attack in Maputo hurt you so badly. And then after your recovery, you devoted yourself and your pen to preparations for a new democratic constitution for South Africa. And in the same vein that you shared such a delicious anecdote with us, I'd like to hear a little more on the textual side of what that moment would have been like, being given such a weighty task to execute.
It was, I would use the word beautiful. I'm sitting now as a judge with 10 colleagues, and we're doing something we know it's historic, and we know it's something very pure. We have no ambition. We're not running for office. We're not supporting this person or that person or this party or that party. We're doing something for our country, for the future, for 30 years on, for 300 years on, if you like. It's a superb function to have as a human being, as a freedom fighter, and as a lawyer. And we debated and argued and wrestled, and we had one very dramatic moment halfway through. The big question was, were we reducing substantially the provincial powers? And Mangosuthu Buthelezi had come into the constitution-making process on condition that we didn't reduce the powers of the provinces. And we were weighing up, does the constitutional text do that or not? Arthur Chaskelson goes home, and as he's driving his car in, there's a pistol put to his head. And he and his wife are made to kneel in their living room. And what is Arthur doing? He's solving the problem with a pistol trained on him. He's such a powerful lawyer, and he comes up with the answer, and he can't wait. He said if he'd rushed to his computer afterwards to type up the answer, his wife would have killed him. But his wife, Lorraine, was a poet, so she rushed to the computer and wrote a poem about that experience. Wow. So the next morning, we were roaring with laughter at what happened, and Arthur explains the solution, and now we could move forward to give our judgment, effectively turning down the constitution, saying what needs to be done to rectify it. So it wasn't like sitting back and watching. We were deeply involved in the whole project, and I think it gave enormous strength to the Constitutional Court. We weren't there as the people being placed or deployed by anybody. We were doing our job, setting the standard for future constitutional courts, for the judiciary as a whole, a standard of impartiality, independence within the framework of making our country a better country. So these, for me, were glorious moments. And looking back, it gave a wonderful sense of validity to the dreams we had in the struggle. The hopes and ambitions that we had are now being incorporated into a document that creates mechanisms, institutions, values. And I feel so proud now we're about to have our 7th general elections, when people said, one man, one vote, once. South Africa is not ready for democracy. And we have shown that we were more than ready. We were overripe for democracy. The real issue is to use our democratic rights to deal with the problems that we have. And there, of course, like everybody else in the country, I'm a former judge now. I'm not active in the judiciary. I'm not active in politics. I watch what's going on. I'm going to vote. My vote's my secret. I'm proud of the fact I have the right to vote. And I just hope so many people vote and use the things that we fought for and look at the values of the Constitution, what it means to be a human being in South Africa today, what we want, and enjoy the fact that we have the right to vote, to elect our leaders, to hold them accountable.
There are one or two aspects that create a lot of tension in South African society around the Constitution, and time permitting, I want to go there a little bit later on. But I want to use the opportunity to welcome the SAHRC's Commissioner, Nomahlubi Khwinana, and good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. The SAHRC owes its existence as a Chapter 9 organization to the Constitution. And I think in a moment such as this in South Africa, where there has been, Justice Sachs talked about contestation, and we will talk about some real threats, as it's being termed, to the Constitution and its existence in the first place. But I'd love for you to share, because you're at the intersection where people come to you and say, please do this, take this up on our behalf. How well utilized has the Constitution been, in your estimation, over the last 3 decades?
Well, thank you so much, Iman, for the question, and good evening to your listeners. Well, I would say that a lot has been done with regard to realizing these rights. Our Constitution being known as the best in the world, well written, well thought, encapsulating almost all the rights that you can possibly think of. We are a very proud nation where that is concerned, as it has already been stated by the retired judge there. And I would say that as a commission, a lot of strides have been made because people are learned with regard to their rights. So people do come to the commission in order to lodge their complaints. And as a commission, especially this year with this new cohort of commissioners, we have taken it upon ourselves that we will be visible in the country to ensure that people are more learned. You'll understand that in terms of Section 184 of the Constitution, we have a mandate to promote human rights. And this is what we have been doing, especially now more crucial than ever, when we have seen that there's a number of parties that are contesting for the elections. There's even independent candidates. We have really come far from where we were in 1994, where it was just parties. But what we have realized is how these rights seem to be violated at a time like this by whether it's members of the public or even the political parties because of intolerance amongst them.
Yeah.
And that is why it is important at all times to just educate our communities and all those that are involved. Thank you, Man.
I want to pick up on that point you've just raised. And Justice Sachs, maybe your thoughts on this election season and manifestos we've seen, like the MK's, which vows to scrap the, quote, colonial and liberal constitution, replace it with parliamentary sovereignty. I'd like your specific view on that point, and then just more in general, the questions to, or the existential threats to the Constitution itself.
Is this question directed to me?
That's right, Justice Sachs, to you.
Yes, yes. Who wrote our Constitution? It wasn't Nelson Mandela. It wasn't law professors. It wasn't business people. It was 490 elected representatives, overwhelmingly Black. The great majority of them had been in exile, in resistance, in underground on Robben Island. They'd fought for their rights. Others were members of the trade unions. They'd gone on strike and fought for their rights. Others were members of women's organizations, and they had organized and mobilized and fought for their rights. They wrote a constitution that was very African. The original ideas were crafted by Oliver Tambo and Paulo Jordan in Lusaka. I picked it up from them. Lusaka, last I knew, was a very African city, and they were based on South African realities. The African people were the great majority in South Africa. They were disenfranchised. They didn't want group rights with whites having a minority veto. That would have been colonial. They didn't want 3 presidents, one representing whites, one representing Blacks, and one representing colored people or Indians. We didn't want Mandela on Monday, de Klerk on Tuesday, Buthelezi on Wednesday. Those were the projects that were being offered to make the whites hand over power on the basis that they would have a veto to protect their interests. We had to destroy that whole system. And we did it through a 2-stage process of constitution making. One, to get the parliament to speak on behalf of the nation, and 20 million people took part in that. You can't be more participatory than that. And 2, these were people who've been fighting for freedom all their lives, with freedom in their hearts and their minds. And that's why what's called possibly the most progressive constitution in the world, because it came out of that struggle. and you look at the text of it, the values are very strong, profound African values. Ubuntu, the term is used quite often, but of human solidarity, of human dignity, of human association. All of this is not your cold freedom notion ideas of basing everything on ownership of property, which came from the West. This was a very African-produced constitution by overwhelmingly people speaking African languages at home, fighting for Maibuyi Africa. Africa came back through the vote, through political power, through parliament. That's the origins of our constitution, and it worked. And we're going to have our 7th general elections. It didn't mean the people with the most tanks in the streets, with the best hand grenades, with the biggest amount of money to corrupt, get into power. Power comes not through the barrel of the gun, but through the ballot strip. This is very, very African. And people like Mandela had been trained as a young African leader in a spirit of consensuality, of listening to everybody. The good leader is a good listener, trained from early youth in the Transkei by his uncles and his grandparents and so on in that spirit. So for me, you couldn't have had a less colonial constitution than the one that we've got. And it's no accident that the building the Constitutional Court is in is a completely decolonized building that owes nothing to the standard forms of Supreme Courts and so on that you see in Europe and North America. So the content then is a content responding to the needs of our people, of leaders like Walter Sisulu and Robert Sobukwe and Steve Biko and Albertina Sisulu and Winnie and all the others. This was the country they were fighting for. The problem we have today is the vision of the Constitution is not being realized in ways that people find meaningful in their ordinary lives. Race still plays a huge role, not overt, but covert, subtle, but very strong for those who are affected by it. Inequality is still enormous and quite unacceptable. We're not free to walk freely in our streets, to sleep freely in our beds. There's too much violence in our country. There are degrees of corruption that are totally intolerable, but they're not the fault of the Constitution. They're the fault of the people who haven't used the Constitution to demand and get their rights properly. Now, this is Albie, if you like, the former freedom fighter who became a judge, responding to the situation we find ourselves in. And I think it's important to make that point. If we abandon the Constitution, then it's going to be those who are most powerful with guns, with threats, with violence, who will take over, or with money. It's the Constitution that protects us against power being used indiscriminately in that way. And it's also been very useful in advancing rights for women, in advancing rights for LGBTQ community people, in making evictions more difficult against the poor, and in giving everybody the right to speak out and to denounce and to make demands on government. All of that's embodied in the Constitution. And I'm speaking now, if you like, as a proud freedom fighter, a proud person participating in the writing of the Constitution, and proud to have been a member of the Constitutional Court.
I think it's really important to have these moments where we appreciate the gravitas of what it took, the context in which this constitution was born, the level of debate, consideration, time, contestation in and of itself. You know, it was an important birth, but it was also a difficult birth to get to where it was. And Commissioner Khwinana, I want to then come to you around the organic nature and the living, breathing nature of any constitution, which should move with the times, reflect the society and safeguard the society in which it finds itself. How resilient would you say the Constitution has been?
Well, thank you for that question. And again, as it has been said by Judge Albie Sachs there, definitely the most progressive, encapsulating all those rights, well written, really well thought. And then I would definitely say that the most resilient constitution. The only problem we have is just the implementation or realization of these rights. And regard be had to, for one, right to education in rural areas, when you compare it with Gauteng vis-a-vis maybe Limpopo or Eastern Cape in Lusikisiki or Northwest in Morokweng, obviously the inequalities, they show their ugly head there, because you realize that those children in those areas do not experience the same education and even resources as those that are in other areas. And that is the truth. But it's not just that. We've got laws in terms of GBV, but with the same tone, then we've got our magistrates who are able to say things that you would never imagine that they would have been said, especially by even a woman magistrate. I mean, there was a saying once by a magistrate that black people rape black people, you know, and that was just uncalled for. But again, it just showed how hurt a society we possibly are once we have these laws that are enshrined in our constitution. But at the same time, we find that we still have a community or a nation that is hurt. And that is why we said as a commission, we've got a project that we call SHINE. This project stands for Social Harmony Through National Effort. This is where we are saying, let's come together. Let's discuss these cultures. Let's be alive to the fact that we are a diverse nation. We are definitely different. However, we can learn from each other. And if we are able to be tolerant of our different cultures, then we will even be able, as we go to the polls, to be able to vote freely and without fear of what could come about.
Yeah.
You know, just now we're thinking about persons that are disabled. And in the IEC commission, which we have asked as a commission, how have you accommodated our persons with disability? And we are yet to realize a situation where even people that have not studied for Braille are able to vote without their right to their vote being a secret, not being infringed upon. But at the moment, we are told they must be accompanied by a presiding officer. If it's not a presiding officer, it must be somebody they trust. But again, it's violating the very right. When we've got people that are outside the country who possibly are able to afford, I mean, in terms of inequalities, in terms of the economy, definitely somebody who is outside the country possibly can afford. But we've got people in our country who are suffering, our farm dwellers, whom we do not know if they're even going to be able to come to vote, whether they'll be released on that day. So there are all these challenges that are just out there, as much as Section 19, subsection 3 of the Constitution enshrines the right to vote. But for some, it is a right that they will yet to realize. But these are some of the things that we are saying, let's call them out. Once we celebrate where we are 30 years later, but we need to still fix a number of other things. The LGBT community was just saying that some of them have changed. They are now, they've changed their gender, but when they go to the polls, they are forced to be of a certain gender. When they don't want to they no longer want to be referred in a particular way. Again, we should be alive to those changes, right, and make sure that we protect those rights.
I want to say on that issue, I think there's a whole independent discussion on that alone. I think it is one that we must certainly come to. I want to bring it to the close. I know, Justice, that you definitely earned the dessert, so I want to release you to go and do that. But I want a quick thought from you as we end on this flag-burning debacle against the backdrop of what you described, hard-won freedoms, a hard-won constitution, and a number of sacrifices that people made to get us where we were. Someone like yourself who has paid, such a high cost to get us here as well in your own personal capacity. Your thoughts when, I don't know if you saw the ad, the DA's ad.
I haven't seen any ads today, specific ads, no.
I'm talking about...
so what is the question?
So it's about the flag burning part of the DA's campaign ad. I'm not sure if you've seen it and you have a view on it.
I'm old enough and wise enough not to get involved in what's become a very fierce political dispute. So I'm going to duck that question and just say that my concluding thing was I lived for 11 years in Mozambique, and I loved the process, the Mozambican revolution, the spirit of equality, and so on. And in the end, it was disaster. It was civil war. There was no scope for opposition. There were millions of refugees, hundreds of thousands of deaths. I lost an arm. People lost their legs to landmines. There were child soldiers. We avoided all that in South Africa. Our process of transformation and change has been too slow, much too slow. But that revolutionary convulsion in Mozambique produced calamity for Mozambique, and it's ended up with more inequality and more problems even than we have in South Africa. So that's part of my measuring thing. It's taking a long time, much too long, but rather take too long, keep our rights going, keep moving, overcoming problems that are not as heavy as the problems we had under apartheid, but still very, very severe, and doing it by getting our values together, working together, listening to each other, maybe having something, a new kind of CODESA on a cross-party basis to get core areas of common agreement for ways that can be followed to get our country to achieve the things that are promised in the Constitution, to make them reality. I offer that as my concluding remarks, and I'm going to go full of hope that I've earned my dessert.
I'm sure there's a round of applause for you in the room next door. Thank you so much, Justice Sachs. Appreciate your time tonight, and Commissioner as well, Commissioner Nomahlubi Khwinana, thank you as well for leaving your evening commitments and joining us tonight. We much appreciate you. Thank you so much.